everyone. My name is Sara. I'll be presenting for our group. We have myself, I'm focusing on San Francisco City Hall. We are actually focusing on Palm Springs City Hall. Raymond is focusing on the United Nations headquarters in New York. And then Ami is focusing on our Berkeley City Club, created by Berkeley. So to start, my thesis title is San Francisco's Transformation Through City Hall and Architectural Influence from to Theory. Focusing in on City Hall specifically, I have a City Hall timeline. Starting in 1840, City Hall was ran primarily out of offices and factories. It didn't have a centralized location. And then in 1868, there was the removal of native lands and the Yearbook Cemetery, which then became the site for Old City Hall. Old City Hall, which is the predecessor to the current City Hall that sits today, was constructed. It began in 1870 and lasted for 27 years, being completed in 1897. In 1905, Daniel Burnham he created a new city plan for San Francisco, and then in 1906, there was a 7.7 to 7.9 magnitude earthquake that decimated the city and had resulting fires for 3 days after. City Hall was obviously one of those buildings that got completely destroyed with the initial impact of the earthquake, but also the fires. So in March of 1912, there was an announcement made to the public for an architectural competition to get designs for the building for City Hall, having new architects come into the sphere. And then in April of 1912, the competition program was released to these architects with some key factors such as the architects needing to be California-based and having licensure in California while also being San Francisco-based, really emphasizing this San Francisco nature and wanting to make sure that the people building for their community are from their community. And then in January of 1915, City Hall was completed, and then in February of 1915, the Panama Pacific International Exposition begins in San Francisco. And so for a larger historical timeline, not based primarily on City Hall, the cemetery is removed in 1868 again, 1870 construction begins, and then before construction is completed in 1893, the Columbian World Exposition of Chicago debuts, which was a big thing in the world because it brought the City Beautiful movement and Daniel Burnham to the sphere of the world, which was realized through the White City and was also very influential towards many cities in America and city planning. And then a little later in 1894, the Midwinter's Fair takes place in San Francisco as a result of the Columbian World Exposition trying to recreate that in San Francisco. And then 1897, City Hall was completed. In 1904, the Association for Improvement and Adornment is established within San Francisco, starting to bring these ideas of City Beautiful and Daniel Burnham to San Francisco. And then in 1905, they petitioned him to create a city plan for the city of San Francisco, and that is created. It was never fully built just because at the time it would have been $50 million, which was a little out of budget for San Francisco because thankfully that earthquake had not happened yet. And so 1 year later, they did reevaluate that plan with the earthquake of 1906. And then again, in 1915, we have both the Panama Pacific International Exposition, but also City Hall is completed. So looking at the larger project site, you can see a bigger scale of San Francisco and where City Hall and the Civic Center is located. And then if you look at the zoomed in picture here, this is the Civic Center. City Hall is in blue, and then Old City Hall, which was removed from its site, stood here previously. And then for a larger project context, some of the key terms, people and critical services I use, I can't establish all of them because it would take way too much time. But some of the definitions I'd like to go over with you guys is architectural competitions. For those of us who are not architecture savvy, it's a competition with a program which has certain requirements that need to be met, and then there's typically a jury of people created by Daniel Burnham with the intent to bring beautification and monumental grandeur to cities across America and overseas. And then Daniel Burnham was an architectural designer who brought the City Beautiful movement to life through the White City Exposition at the Chicago World's Fair. And then John Bakewell and Arthur Brown were the City Hall's architects. And then lastly, Art, which was an architectural style from 1830s Paris to about the 19th century, which emphasized classical elements such as pillars and other very Romanesque building types. And so moving forward, my thesis statement, I'll read it off for you guys, is while previous scholarship addresses the importance of the Civic Center in reshaping and transforming San Francisco, there is a lack of focus on how influential City Hall was as the initial building that created the Civic Center. City Hall was as the initial building to allow for the idea of change within the city to begin to take a physical form rather than continuing to be an idea. The embodiment of change is realized through City Hall, can be established through the repositioning of City Hall after 1906, a deep reading and analysis of the competition brief of City Hall, and through the influential nature of the City Beautiful movement being embodied in City Hall. So to move into my chapter themes, it stems from chapter 1 being about the repositioning of City Hall after 1906, and really San Francisco becoming a clean slate as a result of that earthquake. And then chapter 2 goes into more of the building itself, looking at City Hall through the architectural competition and what change that brought to the city. And then lastly, it takes a more broad view, looking at City Hall as a reflection of the City Beautiful movement. So going into chapter 1, it studies the city at a very large scale, looking at the full site in city context. It spans, as you can see from the timeline at the bottom, from about 1840 to about 1915, but primarily focusing on 1897 to 1806. The primary sources I really used for this chapter were the Sandor Fire Insurance Company maps, as they allowed for me to realize the shifts of the city's grid, along with a lot of historical photographs. And then some secondary sources that I used were a cultural and literary history of San Francisco, which gave more information about what San Francisco was like in 1906 and shortly after, and how the citizens of San Francisco truly felt. So going into one of my sub-themes, there's 3 sub-themes per chapter, but it would take too much time to go into all of it. But to focus on one in particular is a site of a historical building. And so in this theme, it really focuses on how City Hall amplified the burial and the final state of its predecessor to be at peace with the repositioning of the site, symbolizing a rebirth. So through the repositioning of City Hall, it created a new importance to the city. If we look here, I dropped the Sanborn maps and drew on top of them to create 2 different grid systems that resulted in the 1906 grid of City Hall with the Palace and Lincoln. And then if you look here, it's this same little block here, but this originally being the site of City Hall, which this is the new site, so it was moved. And then also looking at the Sanborn map on all the way to your guys' right, it shows where the image is taken from what is called City Hall Square, which was a very symbolic place to users. It was where a majority of the photographs that I've been able to find from various sources, they all depict that they're standing in that one location looking at the building. So looking at the site, that was a very important spot, but in comparison to the plaza that is now existing for City Hall, it was quite a small section of land, while the new site for the plaza is the same size as City Hall. So it's a reflection of the building through the plaza, really incorporating the use of space and making sure that they have a grand entrance to the building. So moving into chapter 2, focusing in on more of the architecture rather than the urban context, it starts to look at the competition brief. Yes, so the key sources are really used for this were the environmental design archives. I would say if you guys have not checked them out, please do. It's a really entertaining source, and you get to see a lot of cool architectural drawings if that's up your alley. But then I also use the competition program in brief, which if you look here, this is the public announcement that they made to the city, also stating that the citizens of San Francisco approved of funding new use. And so going into more of what this competition meant, looking at 3 different entries that did not win the competition, they were still very influential on what they meant to the competition. So in this chapter section, it's talking about different entries which were made by Bernard Cahill, and then also Willis Polk. And so looking at them, they really emphasized the grand vision that City Hall was creating through the program and by meeting the program requirements. Some of the requirements were, if you want to have a monumental feature, it has to be divided axially through the plan, and then also having, it could be up to 4 floors, and like how you use that space accordingly. And so looking at this one is Calville's entry. It really emphasized that monumental feature in the center, having this large central focus. And then also looking at Willis Polk's, his is very similar with that monumental feature that really divides the building axially. And it also is, it had more columns alluding to the grandeur, starting to feed into the idea of Ozark that was really amplified through the City Beautiful movement and what was known at the time in architecture. And then the drawing on the bottom was by Bernard Cahill, which it doesn't really have a monumental feature. The only monument it really has is a tiny little statue here out in the front, but it does really play into the Ozark with the large pillars and creating depth into the space as you enter it. While all of them encompass parts of the program, none of which were as successful as Bakewell and Brown in doing so, which is really what I focus on in chapter 3, looking at how they took the ideas of Daniel Burnham into their plan of their own, and why that really created a vision for San Francisco, bringing the City Beautiful movement to the city, and then also how that was successful through their plans. So looking at chapter 3, it talks about City Hall as a reflection of the City Beautiful movement. The main sources I use are the report of Vic Burnham's plan for San Francisco, the City Beautiful movement by Wilson as it talks about the movement during the time, and then also architectural drawings of City Hall. It focuses on 1905 when the Burnham plan was released to 1915. And so moving into the sub-theme, I'm looking at City Hall as an ideal of the City Beautiful movement. City Hall was the opportunity for the city to really bring the City Beautiful movement to become a reality. And so some of the things that Daniel Burnham proposed for change in San Francisco were enlarging the City Hall Square, having very grand Beaux-Arts entrances that create depth for users as they enter the building, and then also having the diagonal grid system. So looking at the Civic Center proposal, you can see that the plaza is the same size site as where City Hall sits. So they really amplified the scale of the square, and they followed these ideas that Daniel Burnham had while not using this plan directly. They were taking inspiration from it. And then throughout the building, there's this grand entrance that really emphasizes a front facade that was Beaux-Arts in the way that Daniel Burnham wanted, which I think was successful with how they won because of that. And then also, he wanted this diagonal grid system, but it didn't occur rather because they wanted a larger site for the building instead they straight up. And so finally, I think some of the things that truly inspired me about this project was wanting to understand more of the historical context of the building and understanding where have we gone from having such a historical building in an area and looking at it now, it's in a district, it's in the Tenderloin district, which is often ignored by city viewers, and why does a building of such grand nature and beautifulness fail to have a neighborhood surrounding it that reflects that, and where do we go wrong? I think that's where I want to go from here, is understanding where that change happened and how it occurred.
The fact that you tie this into the World's Fairs, and I think those are critical benchmarks for both of these. And also Burning's plan, but my understanding, Burning's plan for San Francisco was written before the earthquake, right?
Yeah.
And then it wasn't really implemented, because they just built everything back quickly, right?
Yeah.
Talked about that. And maybe the San Francisco City Hall is the only thing in Burning's plan. I don't know, the only or one of the few things.
I talked about it a little bit in chapter 1, because there was a temporary building that was built to house City Hall that was built in 1910, because from 1906 to 1915 there was still remnants of the old City Hall, and the city just wouldn't tear it down. And that's something I talked about, like, why are there these images being produced years later when most of the city's been rebuilt, but it just still shows this building in ruins, and like, what does that indicate? And then how does that tie into the competition and what that really wanted for the city, and how the city was strategic about the city?
And how much of a driver was the 1950 Panama Pacific Fair to get this thing done?
I think it was the major focus, because in the program specifically, there's a line that says this building must be finished by January 1st of 1915, and they knew that the fair would be open in February of 1915.
Yeah, that's a good one too. So I think it was really useful that you positioned the idea of some of your key terms for people who were in the audience who didn't know about architecture. I think that was really helpful. And I was wondering if you could, maybe for that same audience, and but also people in the class, if you could talk about or elaborate on the competition program. And so for people that are maybe thinking about these things, so this is the city that's producing the program, and then the architect has to respond to it. So maybe you could talk about what you learned. So how did you study that document? Because this was super important to anchor your paper. How did you study it? What did you find? And what did you find that you didn't expect to find?
I thought it was interesting that the city approved funding for it. I read it here. It was $8 million that the city and like the citizens were like, yeah, we approve this funding, you can use it for this building. While the citizens didn't have much say in like who won or like what other requirements, they did approve that funding, which I think it says a lot that the city was willing to have this competition happen and willing to spend that much, despite the city being in ruins just years prior. I thought that was a very interesting thing and kind of shocking to see, that it wasn't just like the heads of the city making these decisions on where the funding goes. And then I thought it was also interesting looking at the program and seeing like what necessary features they wanted. They really wanted it to be monumental, and that was something they stipulated that like it can have a monumental feature, but it has to be lined up in the circular. So I thought that was also very interesting and something that came up that I wanted to follow up on. Any other questions?
No questions, but I had a comment. I thought it was very interesting that you brought up that it had to be an architect doing business in California, and specifically somebody from the San Francisco area. Just looking at today, I find it very strange that they would make that requirement, because I don't think that's something they could get away with in modern times now, limiting it to somebody in that time frame.
I think it's also interesting because the Oakland City Hall was built at the same time period, but they didn't have the same requirements, but they also had competition.
Wow.
So they opened it up to the entire country.
That's a really good,
Wow.
that's a great point, and that also connects to what David was asking you about in terms of the World's Fair, because it's the Panama Pacific Expo, International Expo, so it's international, it's happening when the U.S. is claiming the Panama Canal, and it's a competition, as you know from the summer class, that it's a competition between San Diego and San Francisco, so it's really about two California cities that are trying to capture that economy on the West Coast. So it's about identity building and California, which is a really good point. And also with what David was asking about, what you found in terms of when this building had to be completed sort of wraps all of these pieces together. So it's California maybe promoting itself, but San Francisco really imposing that into the way that this is claiming something for the city. And I think that is a really good question. So do you want to comment more on that? I think there might have been other questions too. But.
Yeah, I think that's something I try to emphasize is like, why did it have to be someone from San Francisco, and what did that mean for the city? And it really was like the beginning of them making sure like this was influential for the city, and it created that change and like brought that audience. Because I talk about it in chapter 1, there's a lot of comments surrounding the 1894 Winters Fair that weren't very positive in connotation, and often people were kind of bored by it, and they just didn't see it as spectacular as the Chicago Fair. And so I think this is their way of reclaiming the world stage and really creating San Francisco into the city this way.
I noticed like you have a lot of like external drawings and those sort of things. Is there a point in any chapters where you look at more like floor plans or things like that?
So maybe you look at elevations.
Yeah,
In
I
the
look
third
at
chapter?
the elevations, and then also the interior drawings of like doors and stuff like that.
So not so much how the spaces are used inside, but what the doors are looks like on the outside and how that is connected to the city and the urban scale.
I think you talked a little bit about this in your conclusion, just the City Hall being in the Tenderloin district. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the implications of a building that takes so many like Greco-Roman elements and nation builds from an empire that is built on colonization in the Tenderloins.
I think that's definitely interesting. That's kind of like the hook to my entire thesis, is like talking about like the Tenderloin district is not a place that people seek out purposely, and it has a very high unhoused population. And why is that? Well, like I think it's interesting to see like a building that was based in the idea of beautification and like really changing the whole cityscape. Because the City Beautiful movement was more of like an entire city plan, but it's only ever physically realized through the individual buildings. And what does that really mean? I don't touch on it specifically throughout the paper, but I think that would be an interesting next step of like, you have like this building that created such a beautiful space, and it was seen as like the epitome of the City Beautiful movement, but then the surrounding neighborhood did not complete those values, and it kind of shows like how the City Beautiful movement failed in many regards of like what it hoped to achieve.
I mean, I think one of the things that struck me immediately was the fact that the building is bracketed by two almost like disaster zones, where you have it immediately near a graveyard in the very beginning of its life, and then it's rebuilt after a major disaster that caused a lot of death and destruction. And it's sort of this weird life cycle in the center of SF. Do you have any of that in papers with more scope? Is that out of scope, or is there?
That's kind of in my first chapter, talking about I really like focus in on like why did they choose this site and what implications did that have, and it kind of talks about how Old City Hall was built on a graveyard and it never really had a life. It stood for 9 years and then it was destroyed, and so like even before its conception it was already destined for death, and like what that meant and why that repositioning was so powerful, because it was already built on a site that was for
so I can just step on it and push it forward. Are you arguing that if it weren't for the particular placement of the 1915 City Hall, that the larger grid of the city would not have shifted? Can you tell us more about that? You started to, you mentioned it, but I think that's really important because that's a pretty big thing.
Yeah, so it changes like slightly in the grid, and so I'm
Can
looking
you
at
show us actually? Sorry.
it's kind of like here, if you can see it. Like, this like overlays here, so instead of continuing to be a diagonal grid, it turns into more a rectangular grid that completely cuts through that original site.
And then the city develops beyond that,
Yeah.
on that grid, which then would define the Tenderloin